So what is the future of care of the elderly in Ontario? Well, there is a Care of the Elderly Alternative Funding Plan, which was agreed to in the 2004 to 2008 agreement between the Ontario Medical Association and the Ministry of Health. And the working group is feverishly working to get this plan up and running in the coming months. So this Care of the Elderly Alternative Funding Plan will produce a new generation of physicians providing comprehensive, ongoing, home-based geriatric primary care. Just as we saw in the United States when the Medicare fee for house calls went up, if there's actually a viable business case to be made for doing this kind of work, doctors will come forth and do this kind of work. We've seen it with palliative care. Palliative care doctors in Ontario receive appropriate remuneration for the type of work that they do, and there's a network of palliative care doctors. Yes, there's a shortage, but at least there's more than one. So this creates an opportunity for the LHINs to amplify the effect and reach of these physicians by funding interdisciplinary teams through the Aging at Home strategy. So how does one go about stimulating change? I've learned that increasing awareness is a critical step on the road to sustainable solutions. And through my interest in photography and in social documentary photography, I know that photography has a venerable history as a tool for social change. And I was reading June Callwood's obituary last year, and she was a great voice for social justice. And at her very last public appearance last March, she was accepting an award, and she said, "If you see an injustice being committed, you aren't an observer, you are a participant." And that really hit home. So as you heard, I began photographing my patients in 1998, so it's been about 10 years now. And I didn't really know what to do with this work. I was seeing services removed for many of my housebound patients, and that's what prompted me to photograph just this hidden world that my patients inhabited. And about 4 years into the project, I came across one of my patients was invited to participate in a study from a group at U of T called the Home and Community Care Evaluation and Research Center. So I contacted them, and they invited me to give a seminar. So I had a portfolio of prints made up, and I sort of took people on house call rounds with a bunch of photographic prints. And a few days later, the photo editor of the Globe and Mail called and said, "I'd like to see this work." And 3 weeks later, on the Mother's Day weekend, the Globe and Mail ran a 3-page spread nationally on Saturday of the Mother's Day weekend. And that really took this from being a quiet, anonymous pursuit to suddenly being forced into the role of being an expert on home-based care and talking about it in print, radio, television. And I was approached by the National Film Board, and they made the documentary House Calls. And all of the results of raising awareness through photography actually had a huge impact on my medical practice. I actually closed it and decided to provide home-based care full-time, partly to make the point that it's needed, and partly because I dearly love this kind of work and see that it's very essential. Some of you may have seen this past weekend the CBC rebroadcast a story that profiled 2 of my patients on CBC News Sunday, and there's a video clip on the website. And it's this kind of high-quality exposure that's non-political, that's looking at a problem from a humanistic point of view, and it's non-partisan, non-political, and it reaches policymakers and decision makers of all stripes, and just humanizes the issue. So now we're going to go on house call rounds, and this is the corner, for those of you who know Toronto, this is the corner of Mount Pleasant and Eglinton, and there's a little rounded white building that we're going to go into just to the right. And Verna was brought to me by a friend of hers, this very tremulous woman in her early 80s who didn't have a doctor. She was very weak, could barely walk, and I went and saw her at home and took blood and found that she was profoundly vitamin B12 deficient. And one of the first things I do when I make a home visit on a new patient is I ask if I could have a look at their fridge. Because opening somebody's fridge tells you a lot. Well, this woman was living on tea and toast. And with hooking her up with Meals on Wheels and giving her vitamin B12 injections, she rapidly regained her strength, got an occupational therapist in, outfitted her with a walker, and a few months later I went for a walk with her one Saturday morning to photograph her with her walker, and I had trouble keeping up with her. Checking her lottery tickets. And in the very first photograph I showed you, there's a building that dominates the image, and that's a seniors apartment building owned by the City of Toronto. So it's affordable housing for seniors, and they also have supportive housing in that building. And what's interesting is Verna's walking past that building, and she'll never be able to live there because they have a 10-year waiting list. It would have been a perfect environment for her. So she did very well through that summer and fall. And just to remind you that, you know, all of us, if we live long enough, will become old. But we were all young once, and Verna, at the age of 19, you know, you see yourself between these two pictures. Most of us in this room are between those two ages. All of us could end up like Verna, isolated and neglected, and we need to prevent that. I took this picture on New Year's Day, and that's Verna's building on the right. And what happens over the course of the winter is, and it was especially bad this past winter in Toronto, is seniors stop going out. So people who are not technically fully housebound, they're housebound by season. They stop going out in the winter. They become deconditioned. They're left in 4 rooms, isolated. They go stir crazy. They get depressed. They get sicker. And this happened to Verna, unfortunately, a couple of winters ago, and she became deconditioned and ended up being found in a delirium and had to be admitted to hospital, and she was too weak to go home. So she was admitted to long-term care from the hospital. And if she'd only had a little bit more home support and the personal support worker, if she had had the time to take Verna walking. That's, I think, a critical thing, is to keep seniors from getting deconditioned. Our dogs get walked regularly, and our seniors don't. There's something wrong with that. So I visited Verna after she was admitted to long-term care, and unfortunately the long-term care facility she was admitted to doesn't permit outside doctors, so even though I was willing, I wasn't permitted to continue to be her doctor. Now we're very close to Yonge and Eglinton, and Yonge and Eglinton is full of these 1960s era apartment buildings, and the area has one of the highest densities of seniors in any part of Canada. And Connie slipped and fell and broke her hip, was admitted to hospital, and on discharge from hospital, one of the social workers called me and said, would you take care of this woman? And that's when I met her at the age of 90. Her doctor had retired, and she hadn't been able to find a new doctor, and so she didn't have a doctor. And Connie was blind, she had heart disease, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, and mild cognitive impairment, but a very fiercely independent woman. And she lived for her cat. And she had been a church organist, a very religious woman, had been a church organist in her spare time, and still played the organ and then the keyboard later on until very close to the end of her life.